After I married Matthew, my mother-in-law Susan was always asking to borrow money. At first I felt sympathetic and even helped her buy a modest house in our neighborhood, but her demands never stopped. She would always claim it was an emergency, and after enduring this situation for 2 years, she never paid back any of the money. When I finally decided to put an end to this situation, it sparked a huge family conflict. My wedding day with Matthew was one of the happiest days of my life. I can still remember the sparkle in his eyes as we exchanged our vows, the joy on our friends' and family's faces, and that wonderful feeling of starting a new life together. Little did I know that day would mark the beginning of a complicated relationship with Susan. Susan first asked to borrow money just 1 month after our wedding. Matthew and I had just returned from our honeymoon, still basking in the afterglow of our trip and fresh love. We were sitting in her small apartment drinking coffee, when she softly asked if she could talk to me about something important. With a gentle voice, she explained that her landlord had raised the rent and she couldn't afford to pay it that month. When I looked at Matthew, I could see he was uncomfortable, but he gave a slight nod. I immediately told her that of course we would help, and asked how much she needed. Susan's eyes lit up with relief as she said $500 would be enough, promising she would pay it back the following month. At the time, I didn't find anything strange about her request. After all, she was my husband's mother, and I believed helping family in need was the natural thing to do. I transferred the money that same day, but the very next month Susan called again. This time she needed $1,000 for emergency car repairs, and the month after that it was $1,500 for unpaid medical bills. One evening, while having dinner in our apartment, I expressed my concerns to Matthew about his mother's constant financial struggles. Matthew sighed heavily as he pushed his pizza around his plate, telling me that she had been like this ever since his father passed away and that she simply couldn't manage money. I carefully suggested that perhaps we could do something more than just lending her money each month. When Matthew looked at me with curiosity, I took a deep breath before sharing my idea. I suggested we could buy her a small house, explaining that it would give her stability and eliminate her rent worries. Matthew's eyes widened in surprise at my suggestion. He said it was a wonderful idea but reminded me it would be an enormous expense. I nodded, explaining that in the long run, it might free us from these constant financial demands and could even be an investment for us. After much discussion and planning, we decided to move forward with the idea. We found a modest but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood. It was perfect for Susan, with 2 bedrooms, a living dining area, kitchen, and a small backyard. The day I handed Susan the keys, she burst into tears of joy, hugging us tightly and giving us countless thank you kisses. Through her tears, she told us how blessed she was to have such wonderful children. In that moment, I felt warmth in my heart and believed I had made the right choice. I foolishly thought all our problems had been solved at once. How wrong I was. Just 2 weeks after Susan moved into her new house, she called me. Her voice was trembling on the phone as she begged for my help, saying it was an emergency. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. When I asked what was wrong, she explained that her refrigerator had broken down and all her food had spoiled. She needed to buy a new one urgently, and asked if she could borrow $800. I counted to 10 before opening my eyes to respond. I reminded her that we had just bought her a house and asked if she had any savings for emergencies like this. She kept saying she understood and was grateful, but her voice took on a pleading tone as she insisted this was an emergency, and swore she would pay it back. Against my better judgment, I agreed, but this turned out to be the beginning of endless emergencies. 1 month it was the washing machine, the next month expensive car repairs, and then unexpected medical bills. Each time she borrowed money, she had various excuses, like borrowing from friends or unexpected price increases. Tension began creeping into our marriage. Matthew and I found ourselves arguing more and more about this situation. One night, after another call from Susan asking for money, I told Matthew this couldn't continue. I told him his mother was taking advantage of our kindness. Matthew ran his fingers through his hair in frustration. He acknowledged the problem but asked helplessly what I expected him to do about his own mother. Trying to maintain my composure, I told him I wanted him to set boundaries. I wanted him to tell her we couldn't keep lending money every time a problem arose. Matthew muttered that it wasn't that simple. I felt anger rising inside me as I repeated his words about it not being simple. I reminded him that we had spent thousands of dollars on his mother over the past 2 years, money that was never repaid. I asked if he realized how much we could have saved for our future, for having children. Matthew remained silent, avoiding my eyes. Finally, I declared that if he wouldn't set boundaries, I would. And that's exactly what I did. The next time Susan called asking to borrow money, I answered the phone. With a firm voice, I told her that I was sorry, but we couldn't lend her any more money. There was a moment of dead silence on the other end of the line. When Susan spoke again, all traces of kindness had vanished from her voice. She demanded to know how I could do this to her, reminding me that she was my husband's mother and asking if I was really going to abandon her. I reminded her that we had bought her a house and lent her thousands of dollars that she had never repaid, telling her it wasn't fair to keep asking for more. She screamed that I was ungrateful. She asked how I could treat her this way after everything she had done for us. I apologized again but told her our decision was final. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. I knew I had done the right thing, but I also knew I had just damaged our family bonds forever. In the days that followed, Susan unleashed a storm. She called constantly, alternating between pleading and threats. Matthew was torn apart, caught between loyalty to his mother and love for me. One night, Matthew tearfully told me that while he understood why I had done it, she was still his mother and he couldn't cut her out of his life. With an ache in my chest, I assured him that I wasn't asking him to cut her out, I just wanted to establish healthy boundaries. But Susan had no intention of accepting any boundaries. She began calling other family members, telling the story from her perspective. Suddenly, we became the villains. We were cast as the greedy daughter-in-law who refused to help her poor mother-in-law, and the ungrateful son who allowed his wife to treat his mother this way. Family gatherings became battlegrounds, filled with accusing looks, barely concealed hurtful words, and tension hanging in the air. Matthew and I became increasingly isolated. Everything finally exploded at a Christmas dinner. Emboldened by wine and family support, Susan decided to confront me directly. In a voice loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, Susan asked me why I hated her so much and what she had done to deserve such treatment. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Matthew squeezed my hand under the table, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. Trying to stay calm, I told Susan that I didn't hate her, but I couldn't allow her to take advantage of our generosity anymore. Susan laughed bitterly and asked if asking for help from family was taking advantage, questioning what kind of person I was. I felt my voice rising as I reminded her that I was the person who had spent thousands of dollars helping her, bought her a house, and showed patience and understanding for 2 years, but there was a limit. Silence fell over the table. I could feel the family's judgment and silent condemnation. With a trembling voice, Susan suggested that maybe I should leave. I stood up from the table, my legs shaking. I looked at Matthew, hoping he would stand up with me and show his support. But he remained frozen in his seat, paralyzed by conflict. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't continue like this. I couldn't keep being the scapegoat in Susan's narrative. I couldn't watch our marriage crumble under the weight of unfair expectations and my mother-in-law's manipulation. The next day, I told Matthew I needed some time. I saw fear in his eyes, the recognition that this might be the beginning of the end. I told him I couldn't continue living like this, that he needed to either set clear boundaries with his mother or else. I couldn't finish the sentence, leaving the words hanging in the air. Matthew nodded, tears in his eyes. In a quiet voice, he said he understood and promised to talk to his mother to fix this. I wanted to believe him. I really wanted to believe him. Despite Matthew's attempts at mediation, the tension with Susan remained palpable. While packing at our apartment, I had asked Matthew if he really thought going to the winery this weekend was a good idea. Matthew sighed as he carefully folded his shirt. He reminded me it was his father's birthday, and surely I understood how important it was for the family to gather at the winery to remember him. I nodded silently. Though Matthew's father had passed away years ago, his presence was still strongly felt at the winery, which had been his passion. Matthew continued with a hopeful smile, suggesting that this trip might be an opportunity for Susan and me to reconcile. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to think this weekend could be a new beginning, a chance to heal old wounds. But a part of me, the part that had learned caution after years of manipulation, warned me to prepare for the worst. When we visited the family winery, Matthew insisted we take the train to the rural station where the family would pick us up. The train journey from the city had been long and tiring. As the landscape gradually changed from dry terrain to green vineyards, I couldn't help but think about how much my life had changed in these past few months. The train creaked to a stop at the small station. It was a modest structure with a lonely platform and red brick buildings that seemed from another era. Matthew picked up our bags and said his mother and HS sister Rachel should be waiting. As we stepped onto the platform, the fresh country air filled my lungs. In the distance, hills covered with ripening grapes basked under the late summer sun. In any other situation, it would have been a beautiful and peaceful sight. But now, I only felt anxiety growing in my stomach. Then I saw them. Susan and Rachel were standing beside their familiar car. From a distance, I couldn't make out their expressions. Matthew waved in greeting, and we started walking toward them. As we got closer, their faces became clearer. Susan wore the tense smile I knew so well, the one she used when trying to appear kind just before saying something unpleasant. Rachel, meanwhile, looked uncomfortable and avoided my gaze. Susan embraced Matthew, telling him how happy she was to see him. Then she turned to me, her smile becoming even more artificial. She merely said my name, making no gesture of greeting. I tried to maintain a neutral tone as I greeted her back. I nodded to Rachel, adding a greeting to her as well. Only the distant sound of the departing train broke the awkward silence. Finally, Matthew, clearly trying to ease the tension, suggested we should go as he wanted to see the winery. Susan nodded, telling Rachel to help with his bags. While loading the trunk, I noticed Susan impatiently checking her watch. There was something warning in her demeanor, but I couldn't quite place it. I tried to kindly ask Susan if everything was all right. She looked at me, her eyes holding something that resembled anticipation. She answered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, saying everything was perfect. Matthew closed the trunk and headed toward the driver's seat. I stood there, in disbelief as Matthew announced we were ready to leave. Everything happened so fast I couldn't even react. Susan slipped into the passenger seat, while Rachel jumped into the back. Matthew didn't even wait for me to get in before closing his door. I managed to stammer out his name in confusion, but before I could finish my sentence, the engine roared to life. Through the rearview mirror, I caught Matthew's eyes, filled with a conflicting mix of guilt and determination. His whispered apology was barely audible over the engine noise. Then, in a scene I still can't believe actually happened, they drove away, leaving me completely alone at the station. For a moment, my body froze in shock and disbelief. Was this really happening? Had my husband and his family truly abandoned me at a rural train station? I called out Matthew's name, knowing it was futile. Susan rolled down her window, and with a cruel smile, she shouted that I should walk the 5 hours to the house, saying it would teach me to respect family. Something inside me shifted at that moment. The car was already just a speck on the distant road. I felt tears beginning to blur my vision as rage, pain, and humiliation threatened to overwhelm me. But I refused to cry, refused to give them that satisfaction, even if they couldn't see me. I sat down on a nearby bench, trying to process what had just happened and figure out my next move. The station was practically deserted except for an elderly ticket agent dozing at his booth. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. I wondered if I should call Matthew, demand an explanation, beg him to come back for me. The thought made my stomach churn. No, I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, I opened my map app. The family winery was about 20 kilometers away, a 5-hour walk through country roads and vineyards under the scorching sun. For a moment, I considered taking the next train home, forgetting everything, and starting divorce proceedings immediately. But something inside me rebelled against that idea. No, I wouldn't run away. I wouldn't let them think they had defeated me. With determination, I stood up from the bench and approached the ticket agent, who startled awake as I came near. I worked to keep my voice steady, as I asked about any available taxis or transportation to the winery. The man looked at me with sympathetic eyes and explained that the village's only taxi wasn't running today, and the next bus wouldn't come until tomorrow. I nodded in acknowledgement of the information, though it wasn't what I'd hoped to hear. Back to my original options: wait for a train home or walk. I looked at the winding road disappearing into the horizon, between the vineyards. 5 hours, I thought to myself, 5 hours to think, to plan, to decide what I would do when I reached the winery. Taking a deep breath, I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and started walking. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but each step I took was filled with fierce determination. I would show them all, Matthew, Susan, and Rachel, that they couldn't treat me this way and expect me to just accept it. The first 2 hours were the most challenging, with the suffocating heat and the fresh weight of their betrayal making every step a struggle. As I kept moving forward, though, my mind began to clear. My initial anger transformed into a calm, calculated composure. I started thinking about everything I had endured since marrying Matthew, Susan's constant demands, my husband's lack of support, and how the family had gradually isolated me. I wondered why I had allowed things to get this far. Halfway through my journey, I stopped at a small roadside fountain. As I drank the cool water, I contemplated my marriage. Did I really want to save this relationship? Was it worth fighting for a man who could abandon me, like this? The answer came with surprising clarity. No, I no longer loved the Matthew who had left me at that station. Perhaps the Matthew I thought I loved had never really existed. With this realization, my steps became lighter. I was no longer walking toward a confrontation but toward liberation. Each mile I walked was a step toward independence. When the winery finally came into view, the sun was already low on the horizon, painting the sky red and gold. Though exhausted, thirsty, and with aching feet, I felt stronger than ever before. As I approached the entrance, I saw Matthew standing on the main house porch, anxiously scanning the road. When he saw me, the color drained from his face. He ran toward me, stammering apologies, and trying to explain that he didn't know what had happened, that his mother had something to do with it. I held up my hand to stop him, telling him I didn't want to hear his excuses. He begged me to let him explain. In a firm, clear voice, I told him there was nothing to explain, that he had left me at the station and chosen his mother over me once again, but this would be the last time. I saw Susan and Rachel emerge from the house, drawn by the sound of our conversation. Susan didn't even try to hide her triumphant expression, while Rachel looked ashamed. I turned to face them, addressing Susan with contempt in my voice, congratulating her on winning back her son. When Susan tried to speak, I cut her off, telling her I didn't want to hear anything from her, that this was the end of my relationship with this family, and their manipulations and cruelty. I turned back to Matthew, who looked devastated, and told him to expect contact from my lawyer about the divorce. With that, I began walking back the way I had come. I could hear Matthew calling after me, begging me to come back, but I never turned around. As I walked toward the setting sun, I felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Though the future was uncertain, for the first time in a long while, I felt truly free. Without shedding a single tear, I took the train back to the city, arriving downtown well after midnight. I needed a neutral place to stay for the night to plan my next move. That night in the hotel bed, sleep eluded me, while Matthew's calls and messages kept coming, but I ignored them all. Instead, I spent hours researching divorce procedures and real estate sales online. The next morning, I woke up determined to put my plan into action. My first step was to call my lawyer, Austin Davis, a trusted friend from college whom I had never needed for legal services before. Austin's worried voice came through the receiver, asking if I was all right to be calling so early. Through the tightness in my throat, I managed to tell him firmly that I needed his help to divorce Matthew and sell Susan's house. There was a moment of silence on the line. He reminded me that the last time we spoke, I had said things were improving with my in-laws. I told him everything about the incident at the station, Susan's cruel words, and Matthew's betrayal, while he listened quietly, only occasionally, asking questions. When I finished, he acknowledged that what they had done was terrible, and that my desire for divorce and selling the house was understandable, but he warned me that I needed to be certain as this was a life-changing decision. Without hesitation, I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my life. Austin began shuffling papers, saying we should start with the divorce, noting that Matthew abandoning me at the station would be strong grounds for a fault divorce and advantageous in property division. I nodded, though I knew he couldn't see me. He admitted that the house situation was more complicated, as giving it to Susan might be considered a gift despite being in my name, but assured me we would figure it out. He stressed the importance of not speaking to Matthew or his family without him present, which I agreed to. We spent the next hour discussing legal details and planning our next steps. When we finally hung up, I felt stronger and more determined than ever. The next step was confronting Susan, though after what had happened, I couldn't face her directly. Instead, I decided to write an email, spending hours crafting every word to express exactly what I wanted to say. I wrote that I was sure she was satisfied with what she had accomplished, that her plan to abandon me at the station had indeed been effective. However, I told her it hadn't worked out as she expected, that instead of learning to respect family, I had learned I couldn't be part of a family that treated me with such contempt. I informed her that I had initiated divorce proceedings with Matthew and would be selling the house she currently lived in. I pointed out that she had probably thought the house was hers forever, an irrevocable gift, but she was wrong. I made it clear that I didn't expect her to understand or accept my decisions, and honestly, I no longer cared what she thought. I wanted her to understand that actions have consequences, and I would no longer be her victim or personal bank. I advised her to start looking for new housing, as she would need to vacate within 30 days of the sale. I concluded by telling her not to contact me directly, and that all future communication would be through my lawyer. I read through the email several times before sending it, each word feeling like an act of liberation, a declaration of independence. When I finally hit the send button, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Austin and I worked tirelessly on the divorce proceedings and the house sale. We contracted with a real estate agent he recommended to handle the property sale. Matthew kept trying to contact me, his messages ranging from desperate pleading to veiled threats, but I forwarded everything to Austin and maintained my resolve. A week after sending the email to Susan, the real estate agent called with news of a potential buyer. It was a young couple who needed a property quickly. The price was well below market value, but the sale would be quick. The agent advised me that given the circumstances, I should accept the offer. For a moment, I felt a twinge of guilt imagining Susan's reaction when she learned the house was really being sold. But then I remembered her cruel words and mocking laughter when they left me at that station. Without hesitation, I told the agent I would accept the offer. 3 days later, I signed the sale documents. The house was officially no longer mine, and soon Susan would have to find a new place to live. That night, sitting in my hotel room watching the city lights through the window, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The divorce proceedings were just beginning, and I didn't expect Susan and Matthew to give up without a fight. But for the first time in a long while, I felt in control of my life. I was no longer the obedient daughter-in-law, the compliant wife, or Susan's manipulation victim. I was Sophia, strong, independent, and determined to forge my own path. I closed my eyes and smiled as I watched the sunset. Though the future was uncertain, I was ready to face it. I would never again walk 5 hours under a scorching sun just to please someone else. Now each step I took was toward my own freedom and happiness. Within 3 days, I had sold the house to a couple who needed a property quickly, even though it was below market value. I started divorce proceedings, and while Matthew kept calling from different numbers, my resolve remained unshaken. Signing the house sale documents was a moment filled with mixed emotions. On one hand, I felt a deep sense of relief to be free from the house that had become a symbol of my toxic relationship with Susan. On the other hand, I couldn't help feeling sad when I thought about how much had changed since I had innocently bought the house to help my mother-in-law. Amanda and Jason, who bought the house, seemed like such a lovely couple. They were expecting their first child and had been desperately searching for a home before the baby arrived. As Amanda signed the papers, tears in her eyes, she told me I couldn't understand how much this meant to them, as they had been searching for months. For a moment, I felt the urge to tell them about the house's history, to warn them about Susan and potential problems. But I held back. This was their new life, their fresh start, and I had no right to cloud it with my problems. I simply wished them happiness as I handed over the keys. Leaving the notary's office, I felt lighter, as if I was leaving a piece of my past behind. But I knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much to do. The next step was planning my move to a new city. I looked for a place that was far enough to keep a safe distance from them, yet close enough to handle the remaining legal matters. I didn't tell anyone about my plans, not Matthew, not his family, not even my own parents. This new beginning needed to be completely mine, without outside influences or unsolicited opinions. The next few days were spent in a frenzy of moving preparations. I contracted with a careful moving company, packed my most precious belongings, and either donated or sold the rest. Each item I packed or discarded was a meaningful choice about which parts of my past to carry forward and which to let go. The night before my departure, as I looked around my nearly empty apartment, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the rural area code. It was Matthew. For a moment, my finger hovered over the decline button, part of me wanting to hear his voice one last time, to find some kind of closure. But I knew that would only complicate things. With a sigh, I declined the call and blocked the number. I woke up before dawn that morning, knowing the moving truck would arrive in a few hours and wanting one last walk through the apartment. Each room held memories that washed over me like waves from the past. In the kitchen, I could still see Matthew and me cooking together as newlyweds, full of hope and laughter. The living room had witnessed countless arguments about his mother, each one chipping away at our marriage. The bedroom, where we once shared dreams of a future that would never come to be, now felt hollow and strange. When the moving truck arrived, I felt oddly detached, as if watching someone else direct the movers and supervise the loading of boxes. It was as if the Sophia who had lived here, Matthew's wife, was being left behind with the empty furniture and bare walls. The drive to my new city felt surreal as I followed the coastal highway with the few belongings I hadn't trusted to the movers. The ocean glittered to my left, an endless reminder of the new possibilities awaiting me. I arrived at my new city in the mid-afternoon, pulling up to the apartment I had rented sight unseen through the real estate agency. Though smaller than my old home, it had an undeniable charm with its high ceilings and wrought iron balcony. While waiting for the moving truck, I sat on the empty living room floor and took out my phone. The time had come to sever the last ties. One by one, I blocked Matthew's family numbers, Susan, Rachel, uncles, and cousins. Each name disappearing from my contact list felt like a small act of liberation. When I reached Matthew's number, my finger hesitated over the screen. Despite everything, we had been married, had shared a life. Could I really erase him with just one touch? Then I remembered that day at the station, the dust in the road as their car drove away, Susan's cruel laughter. I remembered every moment Matthew chose his mother over me, every time he failed to protect me. With a deep sigh, I pressed block. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Unpacking, arranging my new home, exploring my new neighborhood, every decision from furniture placement to choosing a coffee shop felt like a declaration of independence. Yet despite my efforts at a fresh start, the past refused to fade completely. Matthew clearly wasn't ready to accept my silence. It started with calls from unknown numbers. At first, I ignored them, but they became so frequent I had to start blocking each new number as it appeared. Then came the emails, dozens of them, day and night. The subject lines ranged from desperate pleas to talk to barely veiled threats about his rights. With each email I deleted and each call I blocked, I felt myself growing stronger. I was protecting my happiness, my fresh start. I refused to let myself be pulled back into the past. A week after the move, I got a call from my lawyer, Austin. I heard the gravity in his voice as he told me Matthew had hired a lawyer and was contesting the house sale. My stomach clenched as though I'd been punched. When I asked how that was possible, since the house was in my name, Austin explained it was considered marital property. He told me Matthew was claiming I had no right to sell without his consent and was also arguing the sale price was unfairly low. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. I asked Austin what this meant, and he told me it meant a legal battle was coming. He assured me not to worry though, saying we had a strong case because the house was in my name and we could argue the sale was necessary due to Susan's abusive behavior and Matthew's abandonment. After ending the call with Austin, I stood at my new apartment window, gazing outside. The vibrant, colorful cityscape stood in stark contrast to the emotional storm churning inside me. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if Matthew won. Would the house sale be invalidated? Would I have to go back? Would I have to face Susan again? But then I remembered why I had made these decisions. I remembered the strength I had found within myself and the determination that had brought me this far. No, I would not retreat. I would not let fear and doubt make me question my decisions. I had chosen this new path and I would see it through to the end. With renewed resolve, I took out my laptop and began writing an email to Austin. I meticulously documented everything I could remember about the initial house purchase, every interaction with Susan, and every moment Matthew had failed to support me. If we were going to have a legal battle, I was determined to be fully prepared. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Gradually, I established new routines in my new life. I found work as a freelance translator, allowing me to manage my own schedule from home. I started taking yoga classes at a nearby studio, finding the stability I needed there. I made new friends, people who knew nothing of my past. People who knew me only as Sophia the translator, not as Matthew's ex-wife or Susan's troubled daughter-in-law. Yet despite my efforts to move forward, the divorce proceedings remained like a constant shadow over my life. Each week brought new legal complications and new demands from Matthew and his lawyer. On the third night after selling the house, I got a desperate call from Matthew. It was nearly midnight, and I was getting ready for bed after a long day of work. I thought about ignoring it, but something told me I should answer. I answered cautiously with a hello. Matthew's voice was desperate, almost unintelligible. He begged me not to hang up. I almost ended the call right there, thinking he had no right to disturb my peace after everything that had happened. But the desperation in his voice made me pause. I kept my voice firm and cold as I asked Matthew what he wanted. His voice was trembling as he begged me to cancel the house sale, telling me his mother was homeless with nowhere to go. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach as I processed this news about Susan, the woman who had made my life hell for years and abandoned me at that station. For a moment, I felt a flash of satisfaction at this poetic justice. I told him slowly that the sale was final and could not be cancelled. Matthew insisted there must be some way, his voice shaking as he revealed that he had discovered why his mother had always needed money. She had lost all her savings to online gambling. This confession hit me like a cold wave. Suddenly, so many things started making sense: the endless emergencies, the unfulfilled promises of repayment, the growing desperation in her demands. I repeated the words online gambling in disbelief. Matthew confirmed it, explaining that she had apparently been battling gambling addiction for years, but he had never noticed, always believing her excuses about normal financial problems. I remained silent for a while, trying to process this new information, wondering if it changed anything, if I should feel sympathy for Susan. Matthew's voice interrupted my thoughts as he acknowledged how terribly they had treated me, apologizing for everything, for failing to protect me, for letting his mother treat me that way, for leaving me at the station. He admitted he had been a coward and a fool, but pleaded for help, saying his mother needed it. I closed my eyes, feeling a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, and yes, a bit of sympathy. But like lightning, I remembered Susan's words that fateful afternoon at the station. I surprised myself with the coldness in my voice as I threw her own words back at her about walking for 5 hours until she found a new place. Matthew pleaded with me, asking if I was serious. I answered with a strange mixture of determination and sadness in my heart, telling him I was sorry, but this wasn't my problem anymore, and if he was wise, it wouldn't be his either. With that, I hung up and permanently blocked his number. I sat in the darkness of my apartment for what felt like hours, thinking about that conversation. Part of me felt guilty about my lack of sympathy. Now that I knew the truth about Susan's addiction, I wondered if I should have shown more understanding. But another part of me, the part that had endured years of manipulation and emotional abuse, remained firm. Susan's addiction might explain her behavior, but it didn't excuse it. It couldn't erase the damage she had done to me and her own son. I barely slept that night, haunted by anxious dreams of Susan desperately walking alone through the streets. In these dreams, every time I tried to help her, she transformed into the cruel woman who had abandoned me at the station, mocking my innocence. I woke up early the next morning, exhausted but strangely at peace. I had made my decision, and though it wasn't easy, I knew it was right for me. While preparing my morning coffee, the phone rang again. This time it was my lawyer, Austin. Without preamble, he told me Matthew's lawyer had called, claiming I had no right to sell the house without Matthew's consent. I let out a deep sigh and asked if they could really do that. Austin explained that while they could try, we had a strong case. The house was in my name, we had evidence of Susan's abusive behavior and Matthew's abandonment. He added that the sale was complete with new owners in possession, making it extremely difficult to reverse now. I responded with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, asking what I should do next. Austin advised me to do nothing for now, saying we would wait for their claims and respond accordingly, assuring me he would handle everything. After ending the call with Austin, I sat on my small balcony, watching the bustling street life below. It was so different from the world I had left behind. Here, no one knew me as Susan's daughter-in-law, or Matthew's wife. I was just Sophia. The next few days were an emotional whirlwind. On one hand, I felt guilty for not showing more sympathy to Susan. Gambling addiction was a serious illness, and part of me wondered if I should have tried to help in some way. But then I remembered the years of manipulation, the constant demands for money, the endless emergencies. I remembered how Susan had consistently undermined my relationship with Matthew, creating tension and conflict from the very beginning of our marriage. And most of all, I remembered that moment at the station, the dust in the road, Susan's cruel laughter, Matthew's betrayal. These memories served as a shield, protecting me from guilt and reaffirming my decisions. A week after Matthew's call, I received an email from my sister-in-law, Rachel. I opened it with trepidation, expecting accusations or pleas, but the content surprised me. As I read through her heartfelt words, my heart grew heavy with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Rachel acknowledged that I probably wanted nothing to do with their family anymore, and she understood why. She wrote that she was deeply sorry for being part of what happened at the train station, for not speaking up to protect me, and for allowing her mother to treat me so cruelly. She went on to tell me that after everything, they had finally convinced Susan to get help. Her words revealed that Susan had been attending a gambling addiction rehabilitation program, though it wasn't easy and she sometimes wanted to give up. Rachel assured me she wasn't writing to make me feel guilty or beg me to come back, knowing that door was firmly closed. What touched me most was her recognition that my actions, though painful for them at the time, had become the catalyst they needed to face the truth and seek help. I read her email over and over, feeling waves of relief, sadness, nostalgia, and yes, even a small surge of pride. My actions had been harsh, but they had pushed Susan to finally get the help she needed. I spent the rest of that day reflecting on everything that had brought me to this point. The decisions I had made, the path that had led me here, were not what I had imagined when I married Matthew. But this was my path, and I felt proud of having walked it, no matter how difficult it had been. That evening, as I watched the sunset from my balcony, I made a decision. Opening my laptop, I began typing my response to Rachel. I thanked her for her email, and expressed how much it meant to me, that she understood why I had to take such drastic steps. I admitted that it hadn't been an easy decision, and I had sometimes questioned myself. but I knew it had been necessary for my own happiness and well-being. I told her I was glad to hear Susan was getting help, acknowledging that addiction is a terrible disease. I expressed my sincere hopes for her recovery. However, I made it clear that I couldn't be part of that process. I needed to keep that chapter of my life closed and move forward. I ended by wishing her and her family healing and growth from this experience. As I hit send, a sense of peace washed over me, like a gentle wave clearing away the last grains of sand from a shore. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation, but it was closure. It was an acknowledgement of what we had experienced and acceptance that we were now on different paths. The months that followed brought their own challenges. The divorce proceedings had both legal and emotional ups and downs. There were days when I questioned myself, wondering if I had been too harsh or not flexible enough. But whenever these doubts surfaced, I remembered the strength I had found within myself. I remembered the peace I had found in my new life. And considering everything, I knew I had made the right decision. One afternoon, almost 6 months after selling the house, I received the notification that my divorce was finally complete. I was officially no longer Matthew's wife. I had become Sophia with the freedom to start anew. That night, standing on my balcony looking at the city lights, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the strength I had discovered within myself, for the lessons I had learned, and even for the hardships that had led me to this point. The journey hadn't been easy, and there would still be challenges ahead. But I was ready to face them. I was no longer the woman who would walk for 5 hours just to please others. Now each step I took was leading me down my own path, toward my own future. As night fell, I smiled. Though the future was uncertain, for the first time in a long while, I felt excited to discover what lay ahead.